Welcome, everybody, to the Air War podcast presented by Pursuit Pixpedia. My name is Mitchell Babarbich, joined by my co-host Sam Allen. And boy, that was a depressing episode of Masters of the Air. Not still not sure how to feel about it. That was my third watch. What watch number was that for you?
Second, I think.
Second. Okay, yeah. So I watched it on Thursday night, and then I watched it at the gym, and then we watched the episodes right before we do this podcast. And yeah, there's a lot to uncover here, and we'll go through the historical side regarding the Schweinfurt Regensburg raid of August 17th, 1943, really quick before we dive into the episode, which is probably a good buffer because there's a lot that happened in this episode. And I want to say it's important to point this out. The show's been somewhat criticized for lack of character development, and quite frankly, I don't think that's as big of a deal with a series like this because I'm not aware of anybody, and even people who I talk to, like my mother-in-law, who's not totally into World War II like we are, but she is so enamored with the series and she's watched it multiple times. And I think this series, like Band of Brothers, more so Band of Brothers than the Pacific,
Yeah.
is going to be very rewatchable. So I don't think that character development is that big of a deal. Now there were characters that were killed in this episode that I mean they hit right here, and I didn't even know them very well. So yeah,
So I
Sam.
don't think character development really matters in in this series, just because it's mainly about what they did rather than who they are.
Yeah,
So that doesn't bother me.
yeah, it's more so like the individual experiences rather than
Mm,
getting to know the individual's journey,
yeah.
right? So anyways, okay, so we are still in the point blank directive, Operation Point Blank. So this is the combined bomber offensive from the summer of 1943, and this will run up until spring 1944. And the point blank directive was to basically bomb the hell out of German fighter production. Now, amongst other things, right? But
Mm.
the this is the lead up to your cross-channel invasion, which will become D-Day on June 6, 1944. We know how it planned out. Obviously, they don't know how
Yeah.
it was gonna go. But the Schweinfurt Regensburg raid of August 17th, 1943, which is what episode 3 covered, um, was the first deep penetration mission, or the first major deep penetration mission into Germany by the 8th Air Force. And so Schweinfurt force was to hit the ball bearing plants, and the Regensburg force, which the 100th Bomb Group was part of, was to hit the Messerschmitt Bf 109 factory. Now, in a few different books that I've read, particularly out of the Roger Freeman collection, it says Bf 109 factory, not engine factory. We're just going to say BF 109 factory because surely they were working on more in those factories than just
Yeah.
the engines that went into the 109s. Um, so at the time, this was the largest U.S. raid. Because my
Mm.
understanding, Sam, is that the Brits had a much larger raid either earlier
Massively.
that year. Yeah, I think there
May
was a 1,000 plane raid.
Yeah, so May 1942, there was the first thousand bomber raid on
Okay.
Cologne. I'm saying because it's like at the beginning of this episode, Harding says this is the largest air armada put to the skies by in the history of mankind. I'm like, no, it's not.
Right. Well, but that sounds a hell of a lot better when you're trying to motivate your men than saying this is the second
Yes,
largest
yeah,
air armada ever made.
but it's
Especially
not
when
even
you're
that really.
and Americans love big, So we
Yeah.
gotta we gotta put an exclamation point on that. But 300 and I have 376 bombers from my stats sent out. That the most of these numbers are going to come from the Freeman collection and the American Air Museum website, as well as some of the 100th Bomb Group Foundation. Um, 60 are lost on the mission.
That's
Um,
including the other two divisions as well, not just the 100th and their division.
yeah, right. So there were three forces that were sent, and the way you saw it in the series, where the Regensburg force was sent out ahead, there was fog cover. Curtis LeMay had to make a decision on what to do, and he decided to send the force out and then to have the other two catch up. And then the whole idea of the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, like they presented in the series, and they did a really good job in this episode of of just laying out how this plan was supposed to go. And how they laid it out in the series is pretty much how what I've discovered in all of my my research for this episode. So all that seems pretty damn accurate to me. But anyways, so by having a dual strike mission hitting two cities deeper into Germany, was you could disperse up the Luftwaffe. Instead of going after one stream of bombers, they would have to go after three different streams of bombers over two different cities.
Yeah.
Um, Great plan on paper. Unfortunately, didn't pan out that way, particularly for the Schweinfurt force. And I have just some notes here. These actually come from Masters of the Air, the book. Schweinfurt, inaccurate bombing from smoke screens. 1/3 of bombs hit residential areas, killing over 200 civilians. And then get this, Sam. This was crazy, and I forgot about this. And I've read that book. I don't know, God knows, 3 or 4 different times. But the 1,000-pound bombs used by the Americans weren't powerful enough to destroy a lot of the machining for the ball bearings. And in
Ooh.
fact, when the roofs collapsed in on the factories, they in some cases they actually acted as a shield and protected some of the
Yeah.
tooling. Pretty wild to
That
think about.
that's a good point. Yeah, because you don't think about that because you just think about bomb hits something and everything goes boom, but
Yeah.
it doesn't.
So the 38, it's believed that 38% of ball bearing production had temporarily ceased, but Albert Speer, who was Minister of Armaments for Nazi Germany, had plenty of reserves to make up for that. And within a matter of time, those factories were rebuilt. And that's another thing to point out here that maybe we don't think about when with the air war is bombing Germany was really a battle between destruction, the
Mm,
Allies' destruction of these factories versus the Germans' reconstruction of these factories.
yeah.
And in particular, and that's it. That's all I have for Schweinfurt, except for this, without knowing, the Eighth Air Force actually had destroyed the shop that was producing a lot of parts for the Me-262, which caused,
Ooh.
yeah, I was unaware of that, but apparently that caused significant production delays.
Well,
So
it's
that's a
interesting.
huge plus.
But well, when you mention the industry, because this raid, along with others, but mainly this, the Schweinfurt-Regensburg raid, it picks up Germany's industry because at this point they hadn't fully mobilized their industrial capability. But then Albert Speer, after seeing that having your industry concentrated in one area, it's just asking to be destroyed. So after this, they either rebuild the plants that have been destroyed or they just move them, either have them built elsewhere or they'll build them underground, whatever. So it's because of this raid and because of that dispersion, Germany, not until very late in the war, never runs low on ball bearings again.
Right.
Never until they don't even come close.
Yeah. And then I should point this out. The Me-262 was kind of the first, and that it wasn't totally mass production, but in the sense of jet fighters, it was the first mass produced
Yeah,
jet fighter that the Germans used from about middle of 1944 through the end of the war in
yeah,
May 1945. So the Regensburg target was saturated with accurate bombing. The factories were destroyed but quickly rebuilt, and this was actually the beginning of moving the fighter production facilities to more remote areas.
yeah.
So that this was the raid that basically forced the Germans to move a lot of those factories. Um, Let's see. Okay, so 60 bombers were lost. This was at the time was the highest amount of losses for the 8th Air Force during the war at this particular time in the war. The most bombers they had ever lost in one mission prior to this was 26 on June 13th, 1943. Um, this was also the first shuttle mission. So we should probably explain what the shuttle missions
Yeah.
are. Um, the shuttle missions were um, basically missions where they would take off from England and then like this, they're going to fly to Africa. and then they're going to eventually go back from Africa to England, and then in between that leg home, they would bomb a target in between.
Yeah.
So in this case, for the 100th, they bombed, was it Bordeaux, France? He
Yeah,
said?
yeah, it was an airfield near Bordeaux.
Okay. So in this case, for August 17th, 43, they take off from Thorpe Abbotts, they bomb Regensburg, they land in Algeria, then they take off from Algeria, they bomb France, and then they go back to England. This
Yeah.
this picked up big time in the summer of 1944, which we mentioned in a prior episode, where after D-Day we started to um, fly to Russia, and
Hmm.
then we would bomb Hungarian and Romanian oil fields. So that's the explanation of the shuttle mission. So this was basically the first shuttle mission flown by the 8th Air Force. 60 of the 115 B-17s that reached Africa were deemed airworthy for the flight back to the UK. Now that's not totally a write-off, but that should tell you that a lot of B-17s had the absolute shit shot out of them on this mission.
Not only that, but the airfield they were meant to land on, Telagama, it was supposedly meant to be a supply depot for the 12th Air Force operating out of North Africa. So when the 100th get there, they're very confused why there is no supplies and they have to cannibalize other aircraft
Hmm,
that they eventually
good
leave
point.
behind just to get back to UK.
Yeah, good point. Um, let's see. Okay, well that's my first, and I don't know if I showed it earlier, but yeah, that's my page of historical notes. So we'll go ahead and flip by that. But the unofficial nickname for this was Black Tuesday. Now
Yeah.
there will be another mission, um, which I'm thinking it's going to be episode 5, where we're going to see Black
5 or
Thursday.
6,
Yeah,
yeah.
we're not totally sure yet. Anyways, so yeah, so that's the notes on the Schweinfurt Regensburg raid of August 17th, 1943. So let's go ahead and dive into the 100th Bomb Group. So this was a particularly difficult mission for the 100th, as all the groups that were involved in this operation. The 100th did lose 11 out of 21 B-17s. Um, this particular mission is extremely noteworthy because there's two people who were pretty well known that flew on this. So Curtis LeMay being one. Curtis LeMay led the Regensburg force. Curtis LeMay, famous for two things: the firebombing raids on Japan, and secondly, he was the one who pushed for the M16 to get accepted by
Yes.
the U.S. Air Force, and then eventually it was adopted by all branches of the U.S. military.
One of the very few good things he did.
There's certainly no question that LeMay was the right man at the right time. He was,
Yeah.
but when it comes to a warrior without a war, he had some very questionable theories.
This
We'll
is
just
this
say
is
that.
not a man you should trust with your nuclear bomber force.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So the other person who flew on this mission and flew with the 100th, he flew 100, or sorry, he flew with the 100th for 5 missions in the month of August during 1943. And this guy's name is Beirne Lay Jr. And he was a Hollywood screenwriter. And during World War II, he was kind of the Spots appointed him, either Spots or Eaker appointed him as the 8th Air Force historian. So he would go up on combat missions and to pretty much document everything that he saw, including
Yeah.
an article that was called "I Saw Regensburg Destroyed" that made it into the Saturday Evening Post. Um, and supposedly, Beirne Lay Jr. was one of the guys who heard the altercation between Gail Clevin and his co-pilot. Now, Sam and I were trying to figure out if in this episode they said the name of the co-pilot.
And we don't think
And we
so.
we don't think they did. I've watched it 3 times. He's watched it twice. Between
Mm.
those 5 combined watches, we have not been able to
Yeah.
figure out if he said the name. Now I'm going to get back to that co-pilot's name in a second.
Yeah.
But anyways, um, Clevin's plane had the shit shot out of it. It had 5 or 6 20 millimeter cannon shells through the nose. The radio operator, Norman Smith, had his legs cut off above the knee, blown off above the knee. Um, and I don't think he died immediately like the show depicts. In the book, it mentions that he was lying in a pool of frozen vomit, and he also had just found out shortly before that mission that his wife was pregnant,
Oh,
which
fucking hell.
which they don't mention in the show, or at least they did not mention in this episode. They might mention it in the next one. Yeah, so this is one of those episodes where if you had read the book and was a little bit familiar with the 100th beforehand, it's even more gut-wrenching. So this was a really hard episode for me to watch, knowing all this extra information that they didn't have in the show. Now, while all this is going on, they've got a fuel tank leak, there's an engine on fire, there's hurricane force winds blowing into the nose in the cockpit because a lot of the glass was blown away.
Mhm.
The co-pilot is pleading with Clevin to bail out. And as the story goes, over the radio transmission, the guys could hear Clevin telling him, you son of a bitch, you sit there and you take it. There's some discrepancy on whether that was actually said, and nobody's ever going to know whether he actually said it.
Yeah.
Who knows? Regardless, a lot of people, unfortunately, who watch the show will probably look at that co-pilot as a coward.
Mhm.
Okay. So that co-pilot's name was Norman Scott. Norman Scott was transferred from the 100th 2 days after that mission, if I'm not mistaken. And this guy flew 10 combat missions with the Bloody 100th before he was transferred out. I can't remember if he was transferred out 2 days after that. Either way, he was transferred out after this
Yeah.
mission. That's the point. He was transferred to the 482nd Bomb Group. Now, they flew Pathfinder missions where they would scout ahead of the main bombing force to targets. This guy flew 25 combat missions as a Pathfinder pilot in total with his time with the 100 through 35 total combat missions.
Yeah.
That man is not a coward.
Good
That
God, no.
man didn't do anything that Samurai or 99% of the people in that position would have done. Your plane's hit, you got an engine on fire. They had a hell of a time with the control surfaces.
Mhm.
Because I can't remember what part of the aircraft he was having a hard time with. I think it was the elevator.
I was going to say rudder, but you
I think
might
it
be.
might have been rudder.
It
It might
might.
have been rudder. Either way, he needed assistance from
Yeah.
Clevin. Okay. So the aircraft obviously isn't flying like it probably should. But here's the deal. It's not that that guy was a coward. It's that Clevin was very calm, cool, and collective in the moment,
Mhm.
and he was just a more experienced pilot at the
Yeah.
time. At the time. So let's just get that clear. That man was not a coward. And
No.
before the show, I was talking to Sam about how we need to make sure we point that out.
Yeah. Like you said before the show, it's like Norman Dyke and Band of Brothers. They did him
Yeah.
dirty. Let's not let them do someone else dirty.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, a quick note. And when Sam and I were watching this, I was yelling at him, "Hey, hit pause, hit pause." The top turret gunner in Clevin's B-17 is the grandson of Rosie Rosenthal. Now, that's all we're gonna say. You'll meet Rosie Rosenthal in the next episode. That's a big deal, and you'll see why when Rosie
Mhm.
Rosenthal shows up. But I thought that was a really cool note. Um, Let's see. So William Quinn. William Quinn was the radio operator on Roy Clater's B-17. I think that was the first one to go down, right? This is the one where they had to bail
Yeah,
out.
it was. Yeah.
Excuse me. And out of those 10 guys, 8 bailed out safely. Um, Sam, I couldn't find anything of that particular scene that we
Yeah.
saw where the ball turret. God, it's just oh god, it's hard to even talk about it. But the ball turret gunner is trapped inside the ball turret. He can't get out. Quinn can't get him out. They push. They push on that. Oh, you wouldn't call it a door on the hatch.
Yeah,
They push
hatch.
on the
Yeah.
hatch and he can't get him out. So Quinn has no other choice. The B-17's going in a spin. Gravity is pushing him against the fuselage of the aircraft. He's got to get out. There was no other choice.
Yeah.
So he bails out, and the B-17 explodes. Now, as far as I can tell, on the real, in the real instance, 8 of them bailed out. One guy had his chute catch the horizontal stabilizer on the B-17, and then what they think happened was the other guy was trying to help him, and that's when the plane exploded and both those guys died. And
Right.
those 2 guys were Edward Mustaine and Robert Russo. Just want to make sure we get those names in there since we didn't hear those names in the series, or at least I don't think we did. Now, so all that aside, let's go ahead and talk a little bit about what we saw in the show. I really liked the detail of the flak, or no, I think that was the rocket hit, and that was a thing, by the
Yes.
way, folks. That those were FW-190s carrying. They were mortar tubes that fired a rocket, and they were not guided rockets. The idea was you would come in at a high angle of attack and shoot it into a bomber stream. Didn't really see it depicted like that. He comes in from the 3 o'clock and hits the front of the aircraft.
Yeah.
Whatever, big deal. The fact that they showed it is what's important.
I don't think anything else has. Any
I don't
other
think so.
show or movie, I don't think it's ever popped up.
And let's go ahead and say it. This is the best depiction of aerial combat of World War II since the
Yeah.
war, where they actually had footage of it.
I was going to say, I think Battle of Britain comes a little bit closer, but it's
Yes.
just Battle of Britain. The problem is it's made in the 60s, so
Right.
they can't really, this is the best.
Yeah, absolutely. It made the flying in and I love Dunkirk, but it made the aerial sequences in Dunkirk look like a cartoon.
Yeah.
That's how good this episode was. So there's one part where the bombardier or the navigator, I can't remember. I think it was Douglas, so that would be oh, no. This isn't Cleven's aircraft, so it wasn't Douglas. But anyways, the bombardier goes to rack the charging handle on the 50 cal because he's got to hang up. There's no charging handle. He picks up a shell casing and then was able to rack it. Thought that was a really nice detail.
Yeah.
Another really nice thing that I didn't realize until earlier this week when I watched a B-17 walk around video is the siren when you press the for the bailout.
I was thinking about that because when they first did it, I was like, now, do both pilots have one? Because I mean, if one's
I
killed,
don't
you're not going
know.
to try and reach over and grab it, are you?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would assume so.
You'd
But
hope so.
yeah, I thought that was a really nice detail, the bailout bell.
I want to get one in here. Edible paper. Again, it's another one of those things that's never been covered before. But basically, it's sugar paper, isn't it?
I don't know. I don't know.
I think it's sugar paper. But basically, the idea was they gave the bomber crews their orders, but they put them on sugar paper. So if for whatever reason the aircraft went down or what have you, they could just literally eat them. It's the most surefire, because you don't want to set a fire in the middle of a bomber aircraft or anything like that. So it's just the easiest way to make sure they don't fall into enemy hands is to eat them.
Yeah, right. If you're the exception to that was if you belly landed, typically they would set fire to the plane by shooting a flare gun into the aircraft.
Yeah.
But yeah, that was a nice touch. It's like, well, you better eat the orders. And if you're wondering what would be on those, basically I would say the mission planning, rendezvous times, squadron communications, like radio communications, shit like that. So that's why he would need to dispose of, we'll say, of those orders. Yeah, what an episode. And let's just go back to the story about Bernie Lay Jr. So when Bernie Lay Jr. heard this interaction between Cleven and Norman Scott, it again, the story goes that it sent a boost of confidence through the people who were listening in on the radio transmission. Bernie Lay Jr. either wrote this in I Saw Regensburg Destroyed, and I haven't read the whole article, but my
No, neither
understanding,
have I.
yeah, my understanding is that it's in there. We'll post the link to that in the description. Um, Either way, it served as motivation, or it served as a piece of what's the word I'm looking for?
Inspiration. Yeah, it's
Inspiration. Thank you.
inspiration.
Yeah, it served as a piece of inspiration for 12 O'Clock High, which
Hmm.
he was a co-writer on. But Lay actually recommended Clevin for the Medal of Honor.
I didn't know that.
Yeah, yeah, he recommended him for the Medal of Honor. It was downgraded to the Distinguished Service Cross.
Mm.
And when I guess the story goes, and this is in Miller's book, that when Clevin asked if he thought he should have got the Medal of Honor, he said, "Medal hell, I just want an aspirin." um, and I haven't been able to figure out how long of a flight that was, but it was at least over 8 hours from
Yeah,
Thorpe
it's
Abbotts
got to be
to what's the name of the airfield in Algeria?
Telegrama, I think.
Okay, I was gonna say Telegram, but I knew that obviously I
I
knew that
keep going
wasn't
to do
right.
that.
Anyways, well, so we'll say from Thorpe Abbotts to Regensburg down to
Mm.
Africa, which God, they had to fly over the Alps, they had to fly over Italy. They, ditching, that would have been scary.
Yeah.
But all those guys
No,
got picked up. I should point out that all of Van Noy's guys were picked up. They were
by who?
captured. I think that
Oh,
probably the Italians would be my guess.
because that was going to be my next question was, were they ever intercepted in that final leg to Africa? Were they intercepted by the Italians at all?
Yeah, I don't know. That's a good question.
Because
And
I
go
I
ahead,
was just
Sam.
going to say, because you have got Flieger Corps 10, I think it is, in southern Italy at this time. Um, who came, who started operations down there in 41. But I can't believe that the Italians wouldn't have intercepted, because although their radar wasn't exactly, what we'd expect from the
Sure.
Germans or the Americans or anything, but you can't really miss a bomber group coming over your territory, really,
Yeah.
can you?
Yeah, for sure. Um, we should also point out part of the reason that they did send those guys down to Africa was so that they wouldn't lose everybody as they would turn
Yeah.
around and fly back to England. I can't remember if we mentioned that beforehand. So this is from Crosby's book, and I'll throw up the picture of this on the video version of the podcast. But Crosby has a graphic in A Wing and a Prayer that lays out the lead, low, and high squadrons, and there's an X through all of the B-17s that went down.
Mm.
So the lead squadron consisted of Blakely and Kidd, Brady and Bob Wolf, Cruikshank and Egan. That was so Egan technically didn't fly in the series on he flew as a command pilot, which I thought that was a
How,
funny thing they were talking about at the beginning.
how did he get there? Because that's not
I don't
it's
know.
not explained.
Yeah, and I'm sure that's something that we can dive into. There was so much
Mm.
going on that I didn't figure that was as important to dive into.
No.
Um, so the lead squadron again, so that consists of Blakely, Kidd, Brady, and Wolf, Cruikshank and Egan, and then they lose Curtis Biddick on that
Mm.
one. Boy, that was a rough sequence there as his
Yeah.
co-pilot is hit. And this was something that happened far more than crews would probably like to admit. Is you're flying, it looks like your best option is to bail out. You've got a guy who's so wounded that you don't want to leave him in the aircraft.
Yeah.
This happens quite a bit, unfortunately, and Biddick decides that he's going to try and land the bomber and save his co-pilot, and they both lose their lives in that
Yeah.
attempt. But yeah, man, those
He
guys were fucking heroes.
They didn't empty the bomb bay, did they? At least it wasn't shown in the.
I can't remember. It was
I
before
don't.
the bomb run. I know that.
Yeah, and so I don't think it was shown, but I think we touched on this a bit last time. Was that you don't want to land an aircraft with a full bomb bay,
Yeah, right.
especially not if it's a crash landing.
Yeah. Yeah, you want to
So.
avoid that at all possible. So the low squadron. Now this squadron was led by Clevin. So this is the 350th, and I should
Mhm.
point out the three squadrons of the 100th that flew that day were the 418th, the 350th, and a mix of the 349th and the 351st. They were the high squadron. Low squadron is the coffin corner. That's where you don't want to be. Low squadron is, and this is according to Crosby's book, typically is 17 to 19,000 feet. Everybody else
Mm-hmm.
stacks up above that, right? So your lead squadron is probably 24, 25,000,
Yeah.
maybe. So the low squadron's led by Clevin. He loses Hollenbach, Clater, Hummel, and Braley. And then the only other B-17 to stick with him is DeMarco. DeMarco is the guy who has the dog, Meatball.
Yes,
I
he
know
is,
it's
isn't
kind
he?
of hard to try and keep up with everybody. Clater is played by Steven Spielberg's son,
Oh, is
by the way.
he?
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
So that's the B-17 that goes down with the ball turret gunner trapped inside
yeah.
and can't get out. And then the high squadron, which consisted of the 349th and the 351st, that's led by Veal. Veal is the guy who had to turn back on the first mission. They lose 3 of those 5 aircraft in the first episode, or on their very first mission. So June 25th, 43, that's in the first episode. Flying in the high squadron was Ronan Hennington Van Noy, who ditches.
Mm-hmm.
Shotland goes down, and then there's Justice, Murphy, and then Bernie Lay. And then Oaks goes down, and then Fine Up makes it. So they lose 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 B-17s on this mission. Although they
Oh, I
say,
thought that was 11.
well, I think that was 11 who made it. So they said 11 out of
Oh,
21. So there's 10. I don't know. It says it. I'm going to go with Crosby's book. So that I'm going to say they lost 9.
the 100th left behind aircraft at Telagama, so they're probably
That's
including losses
that's probably, yeah.
in there.
That would make sense. That that adds up. Sam, talk about something you like while I figure out how many they lost.
Oh, well, it's not something I like, but it's more because Regenberg is interesting. This is something I forgot to mention at the beginning of the episode was that Regenberg is interesting because it's almost the end of Ira Urka's career because from
Oh,
July
good point.
until November 43, the 8th Air Force loses, I think it's 65% of its crews, of its original crews. So, and you got Arnold and Spatz who are looking at these figures and they're just in shock because, you don't, 64% casualties is unheard of
Yeah.
unless you're a German in Stalingrad.
Well, and the Americans at this point they're not quite ready to replace
Yeah,
those numbers yet.
exactly. The industry just isn't, well, the production isn't there yet. Um, and at the end of the year, I think I want to say December 43, Jimmy Doolittle was brought in to take command of the 8th.
Yes, that's correct. So and kind of just by happenstance, Doolittle arrives at the same time the Merlin powered P-51 comes
Yes.
to theater, which
I'm
we
saying
should
do
go ahead, Sam, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say, and that's a very important thing is because Doolittle then lets his fighters just go and sweep the skies of the fighters rather than let the bombers try and deal with it
Right.
of German fighters.
Okay, I thought I had it quickly pulled up here, but I do not. Anyway, so the 9 or 10 bombers, I'm not totally sure
Mm,
on how many they lost on this mission. So we'll say 9 according to A Wing and a Prayer by Harry Crosby.
yeah.
So the other thing about the Schweinfurt Regensburg raid is this is where the Americans have to figure out what they're going to do for a long range escort fighter. And the P-38 and the P-47 can certainly do it, but at the time they did not have the external fuel tanks that could carry them far enough into Germany for targets like
Hmm.
this. So, and what's scary about this whole thing is this is August 17th, 43. You don't start to see P-51 Merlin powered P-51s arrive until December, and really those don't get going until Yeah, there's January. You've got two
Yeah.
groups at that point. There's the 354th and the 357th, but it's not until February, basically
Hmm.
big week. Um,
Exactly.
from February 20th to 25th in 1944, where the P-51 in decent, sizable, somewhat effective numbers
Yeah.
arrives. So we're still going to go through another 6 months of very heavy casualties
Yeah.
in the fall, in the late summer, fall, and then winter of 1943.
And so, because it's worth mentioning that at this point in time, because when the idea for the combined bomber offensive by Spats in Casablanca conference was that was early 43, wasn't it?
Yes.
Late 42. So, and Spats presents this idea for the combined bomber offensive of bombing by night and by day, but also what they want to do is draw out German fighter strength because the RAF Fighter Command and some of the fighter elements of the 8th Air Force, they would go on sweeps of France and Belgium trying to knock out German fighters, but the Germans just wouldn't take off because what's the point in taking off for a fighter that's going to be over your skies for about 20 minutes? So the idea was to have the bombers basically draw at the enemy fighters, and hopefully their firepower would be enough. As we're seeing though, and as they were finding out at the time, bombers cannot be unescorted in daylight
Yeah.
raids,
Right.
and so they're not a match for fighters. And I don't know why Spats ever thought they would be.
Yeah. Well, I think there wasn't. I mean, the interesting thing about the air war during World War II is that there was nothing like it before, and there's been nothing like it since. And
Yeah,
it was basically a battle of trial and error and experimentation. The bomber will get through. The bomber will always get through. That's a quote that you see at the beginning of the book,
yeah.
Masters of the Air,
Stanley
where,
Baldwin, the British Prime Minister in
yep, is that what it is?
1936. Yeah, I
Yeah, the
think it's
bomber will always get
36.
through.
Hmm.
Yeah, so they're gonna realize in a hurry here that they've got to do something. The Eighth Fighter Command has got to do something
Hmm.
about extending the range, or in the case of what actually happened, which was they extended the range and then brought in the P-51s.
Yeah.
But yeah, this was a really a really heavy episode, man. Um,
And so it was just so in the episode there's a slow motion bit. I think it's just after a bit it goes down and everything slows down and
yeah,
there's
so
this
you get that shot of the
horrific
nose.
beauty.
Yes, yeah,
Yeah,
right. So like that end of the second episode where they're watching, I think he says Norwich is getting bombed by the
yeah, Norwich,
Luftwaffe at
yeah.
night, and he goes, if you didn't know any better, you'd think it was something beautiful.
Hmm.
And boy,
Exactly.
that certainly rang true in that shot that you're talking about.
Yeah.
Let's talk a little bit about the slow motion. I like the slow motion when they showed it from Cleven's perspective in the cockpit as he pans.
Yeah.
I hated it. I hated the slow motion with the 50 cal. I did not like that.
It was weird, yeah,
But
but
that's all right. I'm not,
yeah.
whatever.
And the scene as a whole makes up for it.
Yeah. Oh,
But
yeah, totally.
yeah, and it's how you brought out of it because obviously you've got this beautiful, I say beautiful, but it's an horrific sort of beauty. This very moving scene, and it's all ended by a bailed out pilot getting shredded by a propeller on Egan's aircraft, and
Yeah.
I'm like, it's horrible. The whole thing is horrible, but it's beautiful, and it's like, what the fuck is happening?
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. It's we were talking about with a buddy of ours before the podcast is there's certain episode. I mean, obviously all it's World War II there,
Mm,
and the way that Hanks and Spielberg depict war is obviously very unrelenting and gritty and gruesome
yeah,
and everything you would expect it to be. But there's certain episodes within Band of Brothers and the Pacific that are definitely tough rewatches. We're only 3 episodes into Masters of the Air. This one is looking like it's probably going to be one of those kind of
yeah.
hard to rewatch episodes, but time will tell.
It's only
Um,
gonna get worse from here.
yeah, it really is. But yeah, so the Schweinfurt Regensburg raid of August 17th, 1943. You hear about this. in almost every single documentary pertaining to the air war over Western Europe.
Oh yeah.
And there it was, right in front of your face. And to see it on the screen, man, it's still hard to take in.
And
It
so
really
'cause
is.
I think this is the important thing about this show is that it's covering a part of the war that doesn't get as much recognition as it deserves.
Yeah.
It's because yes, you've got 12 o'clock high, yes, you've got Memphis Belle, you've got the Dam Busters for the British perspective, but the combined bombing offensive just it doesn't get the mentioning it deserves.
Well, and I think part of that is until now, how could you show that scale?
Yeah,
After the opening credits and it shows the bomber streams going by. I mean, goddamn. I mean, you're not seeing just the 100th bomb group in that opening shot.
no. And so you've got that whole is it the first division of the eighth or is it the third?
Okay. So I'm not sure what it is for this mission, but we should clarify something. When we say divisions, we're talking, and this is
Oh
within
yeah.
the 8th Air Force, the first, second, and third bomb divisions, I think they later became air divisions.
Yeah.
First and third are B-17s.
Mm-hmm.
The second are B-24s. Thank you to James Holland, by the way, for explaining that one on the We Have Ways podcast. But I think that's right.
Are we giving a shout out to another podcast?
Yeah, and then within those bomb divisions are combat wings. Within those
Yeah.
combat wings are groups.
Mm-hmm.
So the 100th was part of the 13th combat wing, which has two other groups besides the
Mm-hmm.
100th in it. Just to clarify. So on these missions, you typically would never send out just one group
No.
on its own. You would send out a combat wing.
Unless it's 1942 anyway.
Yeah, right.
Then you don't have a
We're
choice.
yeah, you don't have a choice. Like, and so that's what Harding talks about is this is the 1 year anniversary of the first bombing mission flown by the
Mm-hmm.
8th Air Force. So August 17th, 1942, Paul Tibbets, who later would go on to drop the first atomic bomb, led the first 8th Air Force, well, the first 8th Air Force raid to use B-17s, where we weren't
Yeah.
borrowing from the Brits and had, RAF crews showing us, what the hell we were supposed to do. But that's another note is showing the difference in the size between what they started out with. I think he says a dozen B-17s for that raid on
Yeah.
August 17th, 42, and now we're over 350 bombers for this raid 1 year later to the day. Pretty
And
impressive.
and as we know, in a year's time, that strength is just gonna go through the roof.
Yeah, they start with 12. A year later, they've got maximum effort of 300, I think it was
Mm-hmm.
376 or 346, whatever the hell it was. And then 19, well, we'll say by summer of 44, it's thousands. It's the most I've heard is 1,600 aircraft from the 8th Air
Yeah.
Force up.
And so I've heard 1,500, I've heard 1,600, and
Yeah, it
I've
varies.
heard one source that says 1,800, but I'm a bit dubious about
And
that.
that's probably 1945 would be my
Yeah,
guess. But that's just
but
insane.
well, it's even more insane when you think about how RAF Bomber Command, which has been having combat operations since 1939, you know, their we never get more than about 1,500 aircraft.
Mm-hmm.
The 8th goes from 1942 up until 45 to well over 2,000 aircraft, including fighters and
Yep.
all that sort of stuff. And it's just astronomical. In 3 years, you've built up an air force that is just capable of completely demolishing the state.
Yeah, and I think at the time of Pearl Harbor, I think there was maybe a dozen personnel assigned to the 8th Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
By the end of 44, I think there's over 200,000 total personnel,
Yeah.
not including pilots and crewmen, air crewmen. So it's pretty crazy how quickly these guys were able to expand over the course of just a few years. So I think, Sam, unless you've got anything else, I think that's pretty much going to wrap it up.
There is one more. Well, there's two more very quick things.
All right.
Firstly, you see the gunners on the fortresses, they're just spraying all over. And I'm wondering, firstly, would the crews in 1943, 44, whatever, would they be doing that? And what would the friendly fire rates have been like? Because it
Yeah,
must have been astronomical.
yeah, and I've seen that come up several times in a couple of the video clips that have been posted on YouTube where like how do they, how do they not hit their own planes? And
Yeah.
it's a big sky. So
Yeah.
more often than not, you're gonna probably not hit what you're shooting at. But
But sometimes you are.
it's yeah, and
Yeah.
it's a part of
And
the war, man.
yeah. And then one tiny little aside I think I'd like. So the two divisions that came back to UK rather than going down to Africa.
Yeah, the two.
Um,
So yeah, it was. So it's real quick. What he's talking about is it was split up into three forces. The
yes.
first force was supposed to go to Regensburg. This is the one that the 100th is part of, and then the two others would go to Schweinfurt and turn around and come back. So these two
Yeah.
other forces are what Sam's talking about.
And although we see all these casualty losses of American, there were actually two RAF Spitfires that got shot down escorting those two divisions back to the UK.
Oh wow.
Which I just thought was a nice little aside of it's not just an American operation.
Well, and that's interesting. And because it was a maximum effort, the Allies sent up every fighter that they could get their hands on.
Yeah.
And there was certainly escorting fighters that took them as far as they could. And
Hmm.
and no joke, you'll read a lot of accounts from guys who were on this mission and lots of missions in 1943 where as soon as our fighters had to turn back because they had low fuel, the German fighters showed up.
Yeah.
And
I'm
that
saying because
happened time and time again.
yeah, because the Germans can see this all happening on the radar and they see the group split, one going back home, one carrying on. So they know the perfect timing to just say, right, off you go and shoot all
Yeah,
these
and
bombers down.
and that doesn't mean that the fighter escort at the time was ineffective. They totally were. I
Oh
mean,
no.
you've got the 56th Fighter Group, Zemke's Wolfpack, flying at this time with P-47 Thunderbolts, and anytime those guys got into a brawl, they usually came out on the winning side.
Oh
It,
yeah.
it was just they had limited range because of the specific models they were flying of
Yeah.
that aircraft, and they didn't have the external fuel tanks that could get them that extra bit of range, which is going to change here in a few months, where the air war will turn in the early months of 1944.
Yep.
Okay, so anyways, let's go ahead and wrap it up. That said, God, the previews for next week got me really, really excited because he's finally going to be here. Robert Rosie Rosenthal, the
Such a
legend.
fanboy.
Oh man, I love me some Rosie Rosenthal. So we're gonna meet some new guys. The 100th will be getting their first group of replacement pilots,
Hmm.
um, which unfortunately is going to become a theme. Um, and if we're this far into the series, I'll go ahead and throw this number out. It's either 35 or 36. I think it was 36 crews uh, of the 100, 36 original crews that went from the States to Thorpe Abbott's
Yeah.
in the summer of 43. Of those 36 crews, only two got through 25 missions.
This is
I
the
mean, think
because
about that.
yeah. Because I think we always forget that during the war we expect when you think about people going through the war, you expect them to go start to finish. But most of the time, the people who started the war are not there to see the end of it,
Yeah.
unless you're a paid clerk in an office somewhere.
Yeah, and in a lot of ways, the Americans were, and I hesitate to phrase it like this, but the Americans were somewhat lucky in the sense that you fly your set amount of missions and then you
Yeah,
get to go home. You can choose whether you want to re-up or not. That's not the case
that's
for the
not how they.
Brits.
No,
It's not certainly
there
not
were
the case for the
tours.
Germans.
Yeah, and so there were tours in the RAF, but it was a case of at the end of it, you got some leave. I think it was a couple months, but then
Hmm.
you went back again.
Yeah. Yeah. And did you get to choose on maybe where you went?
Oh yeah, it was home leave, so you could go wherever you wanted.
Well, no, what I mean by that is like I know that some pilots would so some guys who flew in the Battle of Britain ended up in Burma and places
Oh
like that.
yeah, no, it was you stuck with the squadron you were with the whole time, so it
Okay.
was wherever the squadron went.
Okay, gotcha. All right. Well, I think that's going to wrap up this episode
Mhm.
of the Air War Podcast presented by Pursuit Picks Media. My name is Mitchell Babarvich, joined by my co-host Sam Allen, and we will catch you guys next week for episode 4 of Masters of the Air. We're almost halfway through it. Oh,
Almost.
there's 9 total episodes, by the way. I know there's still some confusion on, well, there's supposed to be a 10th episode. There will be a
No.
10th episode that's going to be a documentary about the 100th. So that'll be really cool to see.
Yeah, that'll be fun.
Yeah. All right, guys. We're out of here. We'll catch you next week. Thanks for tuning in. Much appreciated.
There are.